My fiancé demanded a revenge loan for a massive wedding and called me cheap. When I refused, so I walked away, kept my cash, and then karma did the rest. Could you imagine falling so deeply in love with someone who swore they adored your simple, grounded life, only to realize they were secretly evaluating your worth based on how much you were willing to spend? Because that's exactly what happened to me. I learned, in the most brutal way possible, that sometimes the person who claims to love you isn't just looking for a partner, they're looking for a producer for their dream performance. The air in my little house, the one I owned free and clear, always felt like peace. It was usually just the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the chirping of crickets outside, or the soft rustle of leaves. A calm, uncomplicated existence I'd built for myself, far from the frantic pace of the city. I was content, you know? Happy with my old, reliable truck, a solid chunk of savings, and no debt hanging over my head. My parents had drilled it into me: save, live within your means, and never go into debt for things you didn't absolutely need. Some might call it boring, but for me, it was freedom. Then, one summer evening, my buddy David threw a party. That's where I met Sarah. She walked in like a supernova, dazzling in a gorgeous dress, radiating confidence and a style that felt utterly out of place amidst David's backyard barbecue scene of jeans and t-shirts. She was a city girl, worked in marketing, and had this magnetic energy. We started talking, and she told me she was exhausted by the rat race, tired of constantly trying to keep up. She looked at me, really looked at me, and said my calm, grounded approach to life was refreshing. Like I was some kind of ice-cold lemonade on a scorching day. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. She'd drive out on weekends, and we'd have coffee on my porch, watch the sunrise. We'd go fishing, cook dinner, just soak in the quiet. I remember her laughing at herself when she couldn't bait a hook, saying how much she loved how different my world was from hers. She kept telling me how lucky she felt to find someone not obsessed with status and appearances. One night, under a sky full of stars, she looked at me with those soft eyes and said she finally felt like she could breathe. That was it. That was the moment I fell completely, utterly for her. The moment I believed I'd found someone who truly understood me. But then, those little things. They started small, almost imperceptible. She'd joke about my truck being older than some of her friends' kids. Or suggest we upgrade to a nicer restaurant instead of our cozy local diner. She'd mention how her city friends had these incredible apartments with skyline views. At first, I brushed them off as harmless comparisons. But the frequency, it started to tick up. She'd scroll through social media, showing me huge diamond engagement rings her friends got, rings that cost more than my entire truck. She'd laugh, saying, "Can you imagine spending that much?" But there was always this flicker in her eyes, a longing I tried my best to ignore. She started talking more about her old life, the fancy dinners, weekend getaways, designer clothes. Always ending with, "But I don't miss any of that." Which, looking back, should have been my blaring red alarm. Maybe she missed it more than she wanted to admit. About 8 months in, I knew I wanted to marry her. I'd been saving my whole life, and I had enough for a beautiful sapphire engagement ring, her favorite gemstone, set in white gold with accent stones. It wasn't some flashy, massive diamond, but it was elegant, unique, and I thought it represented us perfectly. I proposed on that same porch, at sunrise, coffee getting cold as we got lost in the moment. She said yes, cried happy tears. That first week felt like a dream. Then came the moment that, in hindsight, should have made me slam on the brakes. We drove to her parents' house so I could officially ask for their blessing and for her to show off the ring. The whole drive, she was a nervous wreck, fidgeting, checking her makeup. When her mom opened the door, she gave Sarah a huge hug and immediately grabbed her hand. I watched her mom's smile falter, just slightly, her eyes flicking to mine with a look I couldn't quite decipher. Her dad was more subtle, a firm handshake and congratulations. But the judgment in the air was thick. Her mom made a comment about sapphires being interesting choices with way too much enthusiasm, the kind of tone people use when they're trying too hard to be polite about something they genuinely dislike. Sarah barely showed the ring to anyone else that day. kept her hand in her lap during dinner, didn't post any photos online like I'd expected. The drive home was uncomfortably quiet. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said she was tired. But I saw the way she looked at that ring when she thought I wasn't watching. The way she twisted it around her finger like she was trying to morph it into something else. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling. The thought I'd been pushing away for weeks finally broke through. Was she embarrassed by what I gave her? Was the woman who loved my simple life just waiting for me to become someone different, someone who could give her the life she'd left behind? Here's what I should have recognized, but was too blind to see: when someone tells you they've left behind a lifestyle, watch how they talk about it. Sarah never said she disagreed with materialism or that she'd learned it was empty. She just said she was tired. Tired means you want a break, not that you've fundamentally shifted your values. And her mom's comment about the ring? That wasn't about the sapphire, it was about me not meeting their financial expectations. I was being evaluated like a business investment, and I'd already failed the first assessment. The question I should have asked myself was, if she's embarrassed to show her family what I gave her, how is she going to feel showing her friends, her coworkers, the rest of her world? But I didn't ask that question. Because I was in love, and love has a way of making you ignore the obvious until it's too late. The foundation was cracked before the proposal even happened. When someone consistently compares your life unfavorably to their past, they're telling you exactly what they still want, and it's not what you're offering. Wedding planning started, innocently enough, or so I told myself. Sarah suggested a guest list. I pictured maybe 50 people, close family and friends, an intimate celebration. She pulled out her laptop and started typing. I watched that list grow: 50, 75, 100. And she just kept going. When I asked why we needed so many people, she looked at me like I'd asked why we needed oxygen. She said it would be rude not to invite her entire extended family, all her work colleagues, her college friends, everyone from her parents' social circle. I did the math: over 200 guests. My intimate celebration had transformed into a corporate event. She started talking about venues, vineyards, historic mansions, waterfront properties that required a year-long waiting list. Each option came with a price tag that made my stomach clench. But whenever I brought up the cost, she'd wave it off, saying weddings are expensive, it's normal, we'll figure it out. I suggested something simpler: David's sister had a nice wedding at the community center, or even an outdoor ceremony by the lake. Sarah's face would CL. Boot over, a tight smile telling me I'd said the wrong thing. She started using phrases like "our special day" and "once in a lifetime," like those magic words justified any amount of spending. The catering became our first real fight. I found a great local caterer, buffet style, delicious food, reasonable prices, stellar reviews. Sarah looked at the proposal for maybe 30 seconds before pushing it aside and pulling up websites for premium companies with plated, multiple-course meals and wine pairings. The cost difference was staggering, tripling our food budget. She insisted buffets looked cheap and tacky, that her family would judge us, that we couldn't ask people to stand in line at our own wedding. I tried to explain that most guests wouldn't care, they'd just be happy to celebrate with us. But she'd already moved on to hiring a live band instead of a DJ. Every conversation about the wedding became a negotiation where I was apparently unreasonable for wanting a budget, and she was just trying to make sure we didn't embarrass ourselves. I started dreading those planning sessions. This knot would tighten in my chest every time she said, "We need to talk about wedding stuff." Then, one sleepless night, I grabbed her laptop to check my email. My phone was charging. Her browser was still open. I saw the tabs. She'd been Googling how to upgrade an engagement ring, looking at diamond replacements, scrolling through before and after photos of rings with bigger center stones. I just sat there in the dark, staring at that screen, feeling something shatter inside me. She had never said a word to me about being unhappy with the ring. Never mentioned wanting something different. But here was the undeniable evidence. I closed the laptop, lay back down, and couldn't stop thinking about all the times she'd angled her hand away in photos, kept it in her pocket during family gatherings. All those little signs I'd missed, or chosen to ignore. That was the moment I truly understood, she'd never been happy with what I offered. She'd just been waiting for me to figure out I needed to offer more. The bridesmaid situation pushed things further. Sarah wanted her sister Emily and 3 college friends in the wedding party. Fine, until she announced they'd all need matching custom-ordered dresses from a specific boutique. We're talking several $100s each, plus alterations, plus specific shoes. Emily called me one afternoon, her voice tight with stress. She had 2 kids, a mortgage, a tight budget, and she tried talking to Sarah about more affordable options. Sarah had shut her down, called her unsupportive. Emily was calling me, hoping I could get through to Sarah. When I brought it up that evening, Sarah's response sent a chill down my spine. She said if people couldn't afford to be in her wedding, maybe they weren't the right people to have standing beside her. That real friends would find a way to make it work. That this was her one chance to have everything perfect, and she wasn't going to compromise because other people had financial problems. I stared at the woman across from me and genuinely didn't recognize her. This wasn't the person who'd talked about how exhausting it was to keep up with expectations. This was someone creating those exact expectations for everyone around her. The breaking point came with the bachelorette party. Her friends wanted a weekend in Miami, clubs, beaches, bottle service. All the bridesmaids were expected to chip in for Sarah's expenses on top of their own. We're talking flights, hotels, party packages easily over $1,000 per person. Emily called me again, practically in tears, saying she couldn't afford it. But Sarah was making her feel guilty, posting in the bridesmaid chat about sisterhood and how she was hurt not everyone was as excited as she was. Finally, I sat Sarah down. I told her we needed a serious conversation about money, about expectations, about what we could actually afford versus what she wanted. That's when she brought up the loan. She'd already researched it, already looked into wedding loans, calculated how much we could borrow based on my income. And she presented it to me like it was the obvious solution. Everyone takes out loans for their weddings, she said. We'll pay it back over time, the monthly payments won't be that bad if we just adjust our lifestyle a little bit. I felt the walls closing in, backed into a corner with no way out. I told her no. Told her I wouldn't start our marriage buried in debt for one day. Wouldn't sacrifice our future for a party. That's when she called me cheap. Said I was selfish and small-minded. Asked me if I even loved her, because if I did, I'd want to give her the wedding she deserved. She said I was embarrassing her in front of her family, that everyone could see I wasn't willing to provide for her, that maybe she'd made a mistake thinking I was the kind of man who could make her happy. Those words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. This wasn't about a wedding anymore. This was about who we fundamentally were as people. And we were not the same. Let me break down what was really happening. Sarah had spent months slowly escalating her demands, testing my boundaries, seeing how far she could push. Every time I agreed to something bigger or more expensive, it reset her baseline for what was acceptable. The guest list grew because I didn't fight hard enough when it hit 100. The venue got more elaborate because I'd already compromised on the catering. The bridesmaid dresses became non-negotiable because I'd let everything else slide. This is how financial abuse works in relationships. It's not one big demand. It's 1,000 small concessions that add up to you losing yourself completely. And that accusation that I didn't love her enough? That's the nuclear option of emotional manipulation. She was weaponizing my feelings, trying to make me prove my love by destroying my financial stability. The cruelest part was that she'd specifically sought out someone with my values, stable, debt-free, because that made me a good provider. But now those same values were being reframed as character flaws. What's the biggest financial mistake you've ever almost made for someone else? This was textbook escalation tactics. Each compromise becomes the new baseline, and suddenly you're defending boundaries you never imagined needing to defend. When love becomes conditional on spending, it was never really love. A few days later, she told me her parents wanted us over for dinner. Just a casual family meal, she said. But I knew better. I felt it in my gut. I showed up knowing exactly what was coming. But nothing truly prepares you for sitting at a table while 3 people tag team you about your financial decisions. Sarah's dad started it off smooth, talking about how weddings were investments in your future, how the connections you made could open doors. Her mom jumped in with stories about weddings she'd attended, how the modest ones were always remembered as the sad ones. How nobody forgot a beautiful celebration, but everyone forgot a cheap one. Sarah sat there quietly, letting them do the work, occasionally nodding like they were making excellent points she'd never thought of before. They had charts. Actual printed charts showing average wedding costs in our region, payment plans for loans, even contact information for a loan officer her dad apparently played golf with. I felt like I was in a business presentation about my own life, except the product they were selling was debt and disappointment. Her dad looked me straight in the eye and said I needed to think about what kind of man I wanted to be. Whether I was the kind who stepped up for his family, or the kind who let them down when it mattered. That's when something shifted inside me. When I realized this wasn't about love or commitment or building a life together. This was about control, keeping up appearances, and funding a fantasy that had nothing to do with me. I set down my fork, looked at Sarah, and waited for her to say something, to defend me, to tell her parents that we'd figure this out together, as a couple. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Just kept staring at her plate like the pattern on the china was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. So, I said it. The thing I'd been holding back for weeks because I kept hoping we'd find our way back to those quiet mornings on the porch. I told them I wouldn't sacrifice my future for one day. That I'd worked too hard to build a stable life to throw it away on a party. That if Sarah needed me to go into debt to prove I loved her, then maybe we wanted different things out of this marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind where you can hear people's brains recalculating everything they thought they knew. Sarah's face went red, then white, and she finally looked at me with eyes full of anger instead of love. Her dad started to say something about me being unreasonable, but I was already standing up, already thanking them for dinner, already walking toward the door. Sarah followed me outside. We stood in her parents' driveway under the porch light, moths circling above us. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I told her I was pretty sure marrying someone who valued a wedding more than a marriage was the bigger mistake. And then I got in my truck and drove away. The next few weeks were brutal in ways I didn't expect. Sarah told everyone who would listen that I was cheap and controlling, that I'd promised her a beautiful wedding and then backed out, that she'd wasted 2 years on someone who didn't value her. Her version of events spread through her social circle like wildfire. Suddenly, I was getting messages from people I barely knew, telling me what a terrible person I was. David told me to ignore it, said anyone who actually knew me would see through it. But it still stunned to have my name dragged through the mud by someone who'd told me she loved me just weeks before. I threw myself into work, started going to the gym more, spent time with friends who didn't ask me every 5 minutes if I was okay. Then, about a month after our breakup, I heard through Emily that Sarah had started dating someone new, a lawyer named Mark, who apparently had money and wasn't afraid to spend it. Part of me felt relieved that she'd moved on so quickly, that maybe now the drama would finally die down and I could start rebuilding my life in peace. But Sarah being Sarah, moving on quietly wasn't really her style. She posted photos constantly, designer bags, fancy restaurants, weekend trips to places I'd never heard of. Always with captions about finally being treated the way she deserved. Mark seemed nice enough from what I could see, always smiling in photos, sharply dressed, the kind of guy who looked like he walked out of a cologne advertisement. I stopped checking her social media after a while. It felt like watching a performance that had nothing to do with real life. But I'd still get updates from mutual friends who couldn't help but fill me in. Apparently, Sarah was already talking about wedding plans again, already looking at venues, showing off a new engagement ring that made my sapphire look like a toy from a vending machine. Friends told me she was pushing Mark even harder than she'd pushed me. Every conversation was about the wedding, about what she wanted, about making sure everything was absolutely perfect this time. I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost wanted to warn him about what he was getting into. But I figured he was a lawyer, he was probably smart enough to figure it out on his own. Then one Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after I'd walked away from Sarah, I ran into Megan at the grocery store. She'd been one of Sarah's bridesmaids, and we'd always gotten along fine. She looked genuinely happy to see me, which was surprising given what Sarah had been saying. She suggested we grab coffee. We sat down at a cafe, and she told me she'd felt terrible about how everything went down, that she'd never really believed Sarah's version of events, and honestly, she just needed to vent to someone who'd understand what Sarah was really like. Megan told me everything. Things I never would have known otherwise. Sarah had pushed Mark to book the most expensive venue in the entire region. Insisted on an even bigger guest list than the one she'd wanted with me. Demanded a ring upgrade just months after he proposed because the first one wasn't quite right. The bridesmaids were all stressed about costs again. Sarah had picked even more expensive dresses this time, and the bachelorette party was now planned for the Bahamas instead of Miami. But here's the thing that made my coffee taste better than it had any right to: Mark had started asking questions. Started pushing back. Started realizing that maybe this wedding wasn't about building a life together, but about putting on a show. 2 weeks before they were supposed to send out invitations, he called the whole thing off. Told Sarah he couldn't marry someone who cared more about the wedding than the marriage, and ended their relationship entirely. Megan said Sarah was devastated, not because she'd lost Mark, but because she'd lost the wedding. Lost the chance to prove to everyone that she could have the perfect day she'd always wanted. I wish I could say I felt nothing when I heard that. That I was completely over it and didn't care what happened to her anymore. But the truth is, I felt vindicated. Felt like the universe had confirmed what I'd known all along, that I'd made the right choice walking away when I did. A few months later, I made a decision I'd been thinking about for a while. I sold my small house and put a down payment on a bigger place. A real house, with land, a view, and room to grow. The kind of property I'd always dreamed about but never bought because I was saving for a future that turned out to be an illusion. I started dating again, eventually. Nothing serious at first. Just coffee and conversations with people who didn't measure my worth by my willingness to go into debt. Life got quieter, simpler, better in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or proving anything to anyone. And sometimes, late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that moment in her parents' driveway. About walking away from someone I thought I'd spend my life with. And I'd feel grateful instead of sad. Here's what I learned from all of this, and I truly hope it helps someone else in a similar situation. Love shouldn't come with a price tag. And the person who truly wants to build a life with you will care more about the life you're building than the party you throw to announce it. When someone shows you who they really are, especially when it comes to money and values, believe them the first time. Those little comments Sarah made about my truck, my house, about wanting better restaurants, those weren't jokes or harmless observations. Those were her real feelings leaking out before she'd perfected the act. And when someone uses love as leverage to get what they want, when they tell you that proving your love requires you to damage yourself financially or emotionally, that's not love at all. That's control wearing a romantic disguise. I didn't lose a fiancé that night in her parents' driveway. I escaped a future I would have regretted forever. I escaped years of debt, years of feeling like I was never enough, years of watching my hard-earned savings disappear into someone else's fantasy while my own dreams collected dust. The wedding she wanted would have lasted one day, but the debt would have lasted years, and the resentment would have lasted even longer. Sometimes the best decision you can make is the one that disappoints everyone else but saves yourself. What would you do if someone you loved asked you to compromise everything you'd worked for? Do you think I overreacted, or was I completely justified? Drop your thoughts below. I'm reading everything.